Hold your finger an inch from the muzzle of this pistol, pull the trigger, and you can stop the bullet with your bare hand. No wound, no broken skin. It just pushes against your fingertip like a toy. Now step back 20 meters. That same bullet is now traveling faster than a .45 caliber slug. And unlike the .45, it's still accelerating. This is the Gyrojet. A pistol that gets deadlier the farther away you are. A pistol that doesn't bang, it hisses. A pistol so strange that when American regulators first looked at it, they ran into an uncomfortable problem. Legally, they couldn't quite call it a firearm at all, because technically, it isn't one. It's a rocket launcher you can fit in your jacket pocket. To understand why anyone would build such a thing, you have to understand the moment it was born into. It's the early 1960s in California. Rockets are the technology of the age. They're lifting men into orbit. They're reshaping entire militaries. Engineers who worked on missile programs are the rock stars of American industry. And then there's the handgun. The handgun of 1960 is, mechanically speaking, a 19th century machine. A brass case full of powder detonates inside a steel chamber. Pressure spikes to tens of thousands of pounds per square inch in a fraction of a millisecond. All of that violence has to be contained, which means thick steel, precision machined barrels, heavy slides, springs, and a recoil impulse that slams straight back into the shooter's wrist. Every pistol on Earth is built around one brutal compromise. To make a bullet fly, you first have to survive a controlled explosion in your hand. Two men decided this entire compromise was obsolete. Robert Mainhart was an engineer and businessman. Art Beale was a scientist who had worked in America's nuclear weapons program. Together, they founded a small company called MB Associates, MBA, in San Ramon, California. Their day-to-day business was miniature rocketry, tiny solid-fuel projectiles for military research. And somewhere in that work, they arrived at a question that sounds almost childish until you sit with it. Why does a bullet have to receive all of its energy inside the gun? Think about what that single assumption costs. Because the burn happens in the chamber, you need the heavy steel to contain it. Because the pressure is enormous, you need an expensive, precisely rifled barrel to survive it. Because the acceleration happens in a few inches of travel, you get a violent kick and a deafening blast. The entire weight, cost, and punishment of a firearm exists to manage one thing: an explosion that lasts a millisecond. MBA's heresy was simple. Don't explode the propellant in the gun. Let the bullet carry its own engine and burn it gradually out in the open air over dozens of meters of flight. Follow that logic and the pistol transforms. If there's no explosion in the chamber, there's no pressure to contain. So the barrel doesn't need to be a forged steel tube anymore. It becomes a simple guide whose only job is to point the projectile the right way. If there's no pressure, there's no need for a heavy slide or a locking mechanism. The whole frame can be cast from cheap, lightweight alloy. And if the acceleration happens outside the gun, spread across the projectile's flight, then the recoil, the thing every shooter since the musket has braced against, almost disappears. On paper, the numbers were absurd. A full-size pistol weighing far less than a Colt 1911. A manufacturing cost that undercut conventional handguns because the most expensive parts of a firearm, the rifled barrel, the hardened chamber, simply didn't exist here. A muzzle report so soft you could barely call it a gunshot. MBA wasn't shy about what they believed they had. Their promotional material called it the first true advance in small arms in centuries. And for once, the marketing department was arguably underselling it, because the ammunition itself made every previous bullet look primitive. Each round was a self-contained spacecraft in miniature. Motor, fuel, and stabilization system packed into a gleaming 13mm casing about the size of a wine cork. But here's the thing about deleting a 500-year-old compromise. The compromise was holding other things in place. A conventional pistol spins its bullet with rifling cut into the barrel. This gun had no rifling, so something else would have to keep its rockets flying straight. A conventional pistol strikes its cartridge from behind. That layout, the designers realized, wouldn't work here at all. So they flipped the entire firing mechanism, quite literally, backwards. What they engineered instead is something no mass-produced weapon had done before, and none has done since. A pistol where the hammer strikes the bullet on the nose, and the bullet, as it flies out, reloads the gun by itself. Pick up a Gyrojet round, and the first thing you notice is what's missing. There's no lead tip, no brass case that stays behind. The entire object flies. It's a sealed steel dart, 13mm wide, and the whole thing is the bullet. Inside that steel body sits a charge of solid rocket propellant, the same chemical family that powers military missiles, shrunk down to something you can hide in your fist. And at the base, where a normal cartridge has a flat brass head, the Gyrojet round has its secret. 4 tiny exhaust ports. Nozzles. But look closer, because this is the detail the entire weapon is named after. Those 4 nozzles aren't drilled straight back. Each one is angled, canted slightly off-center, like the blades of a fan. When the propellant ignites, the exhaust doesn't just push the round forward, it screws it through the air, spinning it thousands of times per minute. That spin is gyroscopic stabilization. The same physics that keeps a spinning top upright keeps this rocket flying nose first. This is how MBA replaced 5 centuries of rifling. The bullet spins itself. Gyroscope plus jet. Gyrojet. Now, how do you actually fire a rocket from a handgun? This is where MBA's engineers did something genuinely unhinged. In the Gyrojet, the firing pin is a fixed steel post, and it sits at the front of the chamber, ahead of the round pointing backwards. Pull the trigger, and the hammer swings up from underneath and strikes the rocket on the nose. The blow shoves the entire round backwards, slamming its primer against that fixed pin behind it. The motor lights, thrust builds, and now the rocket accelerates forward, riding up and over the hammer that just hit it, physically shoving it back down and cocking it for the next shot. Sit with that for a second. The gun doesn't reload itself with springs, gas pistons, or recoiling slides. The bullet reloads the gun on its way out. Every projectile that leaves the muzzle leaves the weapon cocked, with the next of 6 rounds feeding up from the magazine, ready to fire again. Engineers have a term for a system like this: self-actuating. The bullet is the action, and the consequences cascade through the whole design. At the instant of firing, a conventional pistol chamber is a contained bomb. Inside the Gyrojet, pressure barely climbs past what you'd find in a bicycle tire, because the burn happens mostly outside the gun. So the barrel isn't really a barrel, it's a thin guide tube with ventilation slots cut straight through it, slots that let the rocket exhaust bleed out sideways. You can literally see daylight through the side of this pistol. No pressure means no forged steel. The frame is cast Zamac, zinc alloy, the same family of metal used in toy cars. The whole loaded pistol weighs around 400 grams. A loaded Colt 1911 weighs 3 times that. Then there's the firing experience itself, and this is where the Gyrojet stops sounding like engineering and starts sounding like science fiction. There is no bang. The primer gives a sharp pop, about as loud as a cap gun, and then the round leaves with a rising hiss, like an angry bottle rocket. No muzzle flash to speak of. And almost no recoil, because recoil is the reaction to accelerating a bullet violently inside the gun. And this bullet barely accelerates inside the gun at all. It does its accelerating downrange. The motor burns for roughly 1/10 of a second after launch, and in that time the round just keeps gaining speed. At the muzzle, it's moving at jogging pace. At 10 meters, it's already deep into pistol bullet territory. Around 18 to 20 meters out, it passes 380 meters per second, faster than a .45 ACP ever flies at any point. And it's still pulling away at distances where every conventional pistol bullet in the world is bleeding. Energy to air resistance. A gun that hits harder at 50 meters than at 5. In 1965, nothing else on Earth could say that. If this kind of teardown is your thing, machines pulled apart down to the last nozzle, a subscription genuinely helps decide which forgotten weapon gets this treatment next. Because MBA believed those numbers were the whole story. Low cost, no recoil, no blast. Energy that grows with range. On paper, they hadn't just improved the handgun, they'd made every handgun on the planet obsolete. But read that performance curve again, slowly. Gain speed over the first 20 meters. Which means at 1 meter, at the distance where someone is grabbing your collar, at the exact distance a defensive pistol exists for, the Gyrojet is moving at the speed of a thrown baseball. The most futuristic handgun ever built had a blind spot, and it was standing right in front of it. In 1965, MBA's salesmen had a favorite party trick. They'd hold a hand right at the muzzle of a firing Gyrojet and let the rocket push harmlessly against their palm. The crowd loved it. Look how safe. Look how controllable. Look how futuristic. They were demonstrating the exact flaw that would kill the product. They just didn't realize it yet. Because think about when a person actually draws a pistol. Not at 50 meters, not across a field. Handgun fights happens at arm's length, in doorways, in stairwells, across the width of a car. Police statistics have said it for decades. Most defensive shootings happen inside 3 meters. And inside 3 meters, the Gyrojet was arguably the least dangerous handgun ever sold. At contact distance, that rocket is moving slower than a paintball. There are accounts of test rounds bouncing off plywood at close range. A weapon marketed for personal defense was weakest at precisely the distance where personal defense happens. MBA had built a duelist pistol for a world with no duels. That was the first blow. The second was worse, because it attacked the one thing no gun can survive losing: the ability to hit what you aim at. Remember, the round stabilizes itself with those 4 canted exhaust nozzles, which means accuracy doesn't live in the barrel anymore. It lives in the ammunition factory. Every nozzle has to be angled identically, drilled identically, finished identically. A conventional barrel gives every bullet the same spin, shot after shot, for decades. The Gyrojet gave every round its own personal spin and its own personal opinion about where to go. In practice, the tolerances didn't hold. A nozzle fractionally off angle, a burr of metal, a slightly uneven propellant burn, and the thrust vector tilts. The rocket doesn't just drift, it powers itself off course, engine still burning, amplifying its own error for 20 meters. Test results were brutal. At 100 meters, military evaluators recorded dispersion measured in meters, not centimeters. One documented trial put rounds 3 meters from the point of aim. Picture that. A shooter who could hit a doorknob with an ordinary service pistol now couldn't reliably hit the door. Some rounds flew true, some corkscrewed. Some tumbled off in directions that made rangemasters flinch. Every trigger pull was a lottery ticket, and you found out if you'd won somewhere downrange. The third blow came printed on the price tag. A Gyrojet round wasn't stamped out of brass by the million tools. It was a small precision rocket motor, and it cost like $1. Over $1 per shot in 1960s money, at a time when ordinary pistol ammunition cost a few cents. Practice, the thing that makes a shooter, cost roughly 20 times more per trigger pull than the competition. Owners responded predictably. They didn't practice. with the gun, whose accuracy was already a gamble, and when a round failed, it failed ugly. The propellant hated moisture. Primers misfired. And a misfire in this system isn't the crisp click and clear of a conventional pistol. The self-actuating cycle means a dead rocket just sits there, a stalled machine with a live motor, while the shooter works out how to get it out of the gun. Reliability estimates from surviving ammunition lots run to failure rates no soldier would accept. One dud in every handful of rounds. The U.S. military did look, seriously. This was the Vietnam era, and the services were hungry for exotic solutions. They tested fléchette rifles, caseless ammunition, anything with a future attached. Gyrojets went through formal evaluation. Advanced projects offices sniffed around the technology. Special operations units examined it for exactly the mission its silence suggested. The verdict was quiet and unanimous. A weapon that can't hit reliably, can't be trusted to fire, costs a fortune to feed, and goes soft at knife-fighting distance is not a weapon. It's a demonstration. The Army passed. The program stayed a curiosity. By any normal logic, that's the end. A clever idea. 3 fatal flaws. A polite rejection. A footnote. 99 failed guns out of 100 die exactly here, unnamed and unmourned. The Gyrojet didn't, because while the engineers were losing the argument on the test range, the pistol itself was about to win somewhere no ballistics table could touch. Within 2 years, this commercially doomed rocket gun would be pressed into the hands of the most famous fictional spy on Earth, carried into a real war zone by American officers who bought it with their own money, and then outlawed by the United States Congress in a single sentence that never even mentioned its name. The Gyrojet went on sale to the American public wrapped in the full theater of the space age, presentation cases lined with velvet, serial-numbered Mark I pistols marketed like collector's items from the future, magazine ads that didn't sell a firearm so much as a ticket to tomorrow, own the first new idea in small arms since gunpowder. And here's the strange part. Legally, that ad copy was more accurate than anyone intended. When the Gyrojet hit the market, American gun law defined a firearm around a specific mechanical event, a projectile driven by the explosion of a propellant inside the weapon. The Gyrojet's rounds ignited in the gun, but did their real work in the air. The projectile drove itself. For a window of time in the mid-1960s, the most advanced handgun in America occupied a genuine legal gray zone. Early rounds could reportedly be shipped through the mail like fireworks, because the machine in front of regulators didn't match the paperwork categories that existed. The government's own definitions had been written for a technology the Gyrojet had just left behind. While the lawyers squinted, Hollywood didn't hesitate. In 1967, You Only Live Twice put Sean Connery's James Bond in Japan, and put Gyrojets in the film. On screen, the rocket gun was exactly what MBA had always claimed it was. The sidearm of the future, exotic, silent, ahead of everyone. The film reached tens of millions of people. No advertising budget on Earth could have bought that placement, and a pistol failing every practical test it faced suddenly had the most glamorous endorsement in popular culture. The strangest chapter, though, wasn't fictional. It was Vietnam. The Gyrojet was never issued to American forces. The military had already passed. But officers and air crews could carry privately purchased sidearms, and private money bought something no arms room offered, a pistol weighing next to nothing, with no muzzle flash to give away a position at night, and a report the jungle swallowed whole. Pilots tucked them into survival vests. Officers carried them as backup guns. At least one Marine officer is documented to have carried a Gyrojet in combat, one of the only times a rocket pistol has ever been used in war by anyone. Out there, the weapon's flaws mattered less than its promises. If you ever actually needed it, you'd be shooting to survive, not qualifying on a range. So by 1967, the Gyrojet had a paradox for a resume. rejected by the Pentagon, adored by Hollywood, carried voluntarily into a real war, and hovering half outside the legal definition of a gun. What it didn't have was time. In 1968, after the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, Congress passed the Gun Control Act, the biggest overhaul of American firearms law in a generation. Buried in its text was a definitional line. Any firearm with a bore diameter over half an inch was now a destructive device, regulated in the same category as grenade launchers and artillery. The threshold was 12.7 millimeters. The Gyrojet was 13. No hearing mentioned it. No congressman debated rocket pistols. The law was aimed at crude shotgun-caliber weapons and military ordnance, and the Gyrojet simply fell on the wrong side of a number. Every 13-millimeter pistol MBA had ever sold became, overnight, paperwork-heavy contraband for the ordinary buyer. The entire product line was dead. Killed by a definition, not a verdict. The law never even needed to name it. MBA scrambled. The fix looked simple on paper. Shrink the round below the legal line. A 12-millimeter Gyrojet family went into production. Same concept, fractionally smaller rocket. But remember what accuracy depended on. Nozzle tolerances that were already failing at 13 millimeters. Shrink the round and every tolerance gets tighter. Every nozzle harder to drill true. Every unit more expensive for a product whose reputation was already gone. Fewer of the 12-millimeter guns were made, they performed no better, and the buying public had moved on. Estimates put total Gyrojet production across all models at only around 1,000 units. By the early 1970s, the pistol was finished. Not defeated by a rival design, not disproven in some decisive test, filed out of existence by a statute after physics and economics had already done the wounding, and that should be the obituary. Except MB Associates didn't die with its pistol. The company walked out of the wreckage carrying the one piece of the Gyrojet that actually worked, and that piece would go on to save more lives than the pistol ever threatened, sitting quietly in survival kits from Alaska to the South China Sea. Strip away everything that failed about the Gyrojet, and one thing remained standing. MBA had genuinely mastered the miniature rocket. Small, solid fuel, spin-stabilized, launched from something you could hold in one hand. The pistol around that rocket was the mistake. So the company deleted the pistol. What survived was a device the size of a fountain pen. A miniature Gyrojet rocket repurposed to carry a screaming red signal instead of a warhead. No gray zone legality, no accuracy problem. A flare doesn't need to hit anything, it needs to be seen. And suddenly, every weakness inverted into a strength. Tiny? Fits in a pilot's survival vest. Almost no launch signature? Doesn't matter. Cheap tube instead of a barrel? Perfect. Pen flares descended from this design, went into military survival kits, into the pockets of air crews over Southeast Asia, and eventually into civilian kits for sailors and bush pilots. Downed airmen were located because of a signal fired from a rocket the size of a lipstick. The pistol that couldn't reliably defend anyone became the ancestor of a device that rescued people for decades. MBA kept pushing the core technology into stranger corners while it lasted. A fin-jet variant swapped spin for fin stabilization. Lance jet dart concepts were explored for underwater use, where a self-propelled projectile laughs at water resistance that stops conventional bullets within a couple of meters. There were multi-barrel concepts, aircraft armament proposals, an entire speculative family tree, grown from one 13-millimeter seed. Almost none of it reached service. All of it proved the same point. The idea refused to stay dead. Then the market delivered its verdict, and it's the opposite of the one you'd expect. Today, a Gyrojet pistol in good condition sells for thousands of dollars. Rare variants, carbines, the scarce 12-millimeter guns, go far higher. But the real absurdity is the ammunition. A single original round now sells for more than the entire pistol cost new in 1965. And the surviving ammunition pool never grows. Every year, it only shrinks, which creates the collector's paradox. Almost nobody fires a Gyrojet anymore, because every trigger pull burns a three-figure artifact, and half a century of propellant chemistry means the round might not even light. The gun that once begged to be taken seriously is now handled like a museum piece, precisely because it wasn't. But price tags aren't a legacy. Here's the legacy. The problem that killed the Gyrojet was never the rocket. It was control. MBA built a projectile that kept accelerating, kept burning, kept flying long after it left the gun, and then had no way to correct it. 4 fixed nozzles, drilled in a 1960s factory, made every error permanent and self-amplifying. The projectile had an engine, but no brain. Now jump forward 50 years. DARPA's X-Acto program demonstrates a 50 caliber sniper round that steers itself in flight, adjusting its path toward a target, correcting for wind, even tracking movement. Guided mortar rounds, laser riding missiles small enough to shoulder fire, projectiles across the modern battlefield doing exactly what the Gyrojet's rounds did, working after launch, except now with sensors and processors making thousands of corrections per second. The exact capability that would have saved the Gyrojet. Onboard guidance turns a self-propelled projectile's flight time from its fatal weakness into its greatest asset. Time to think, time to steer, time to correct. MBA's engineers had the propulsion in 1965. The electronics they needed wouldn't exist for 2 generations. They built the body of a smart bullet half a century before anyone could build its mind. That's the real biography of this weapon. Not a joke, not a scam, not a footnote, a correct answer that arrived before its question. The velvet cases, the Bond film, the officers in Vietnam, the single line of law that erased it. All of it happened to a machine whose only unforgivable flaw was its birthday. If this story earned the next 50 minutes of your day, subscribe. There's a long list of weapons like this one. Brilliant, doomed, and buried by timing rather than by stupidity. They're getting the same teardown, and you'll want to be here when they do. Because the Gyrojet never actually lost the argument. Somewhere right now, in a defense lab running guidance code, through a self-propelled round, its idea is loaded again, and this time, it can aim.